experience. I mean, I've heard over the last 10 years, I've heard from many people who are either levitating or they are giving intense healing. They've had near-death experiences. And spiritual emergency, which is when spiritual awakening becomes a physical crisis, is definitely becoming more and more common.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, you said about Gary Schwartz, a lot of his experiments, you did some experiments which are written about in your second book, Evidence for the Sixth Sense.
That's right. Yeah. He explained to me that what we call matter, which is what you and I and the whole universe is made of, is basically 99.999% empty space. And that just because we can't see something, it doesn't mean it's not there. And he explained how we are transformers and receivers of information. And in fact, I've since discovered that about 99% of this physical universe is unseen to us.
That sounds pretty amazing.
But there are many other levels of reality that people like he's a physicist, William Tiller in Arizona. He spent 50 years studying matter and consciousness, and they have discovered other levels of reality that they can now measure, that they know are there, and that when we couple with these other levels of reality, we are going to be capable of some amazing things. I used to call them my tricks. So yes, Gary Schwartz now says that the evidence that we survive physical death is now so overwhelming. And the body of evidence is not just from him, it's from many august bodies around the world. He said it's now up to the skeptics to prove that we don't in fact survive.
Right. In the book Countdown to Coherence, could you explain to the listeners what you actually mean by coherence?
Well, in the dictionary, coherence is defined as everything coming together as one. But the point is now that scientists in Iowa have stated that there is now scientific evidence to show that the brains of truly enlightened men and women work as a coherent unit. This means that all parts of the brain become synchronized, and that the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain are working as one. And this is known as total brain coherence. And Bill Tiller said to me that in the beginning, everything was totally coherent, which is what God is. In physics, he says, we term this in phase. All things, all levels of energy were one. And that's exactly how I felt when I was in that very heightened state. You feel like you're sitting on a pinhead, and to maintain that total coherence, I can tell you, is very, very difficult. And so this is why in this new book, I've interviewed many, many, many very enlightened people who explain how we can all attain brain coherence and how we can all become more enlightened, but safely and slowly. But once your brain starts to become more synchronized, apparently it ramps up something called the thalamus, an area in the center of the brain. So the thalamus controls the senses, sight, hearing, touch, smell, and so on. And the point being that in that moment in Harrods, it was like all my senses had been switched up to 500%. I could hear more, I could smell more, I could see more. And this, it's not the pineal gland that's the seat of the soul. It's more the thalamus. So that as your brain becomes more and more coherent, more synchronized, your senses become more heightened. And this is when you develop what they call a sixth sense. You become more intuitive. But as you well know, Mark, you need to learn discernment, and you need to learn how to trust that intuition. You need to learn whether it's coming from your ego or whether it's coming from what I call pure coherence, which is what God is.
Right. I was going to ask you, there's a lot of people who are talking about ascension and sort of raising your consciousness and so on. Would you say there's any link between coherence and ascension at all?
Well, it's really funny. I asked quite a few people that very question, and Dr. Serena Rooney-Dougal, who's a very eminent parapsychologist, I said, what does the word ascension mean to you? And she said, it means New Age bullshit, Hazel. So I thought that was rather funny. So it's a term that's become very popular.
Yeah, definitely.
But the point is, the more coherent you become, the more you're able to do more amazing things. But the most important thing is you have to link to it's called the magnetic information wave level. You have to link to these other levels of reality. And when and if you can get into this process and become totally coherent, then there could come a point when you are no longer operating in this coarse physical dimension. You will still be existing as a field information outside space-time. And to me, that's what ascension means. Because at one point I began to dematerialize, which I have seen masters do. And it's not that they're no longer there, it's just that they're operating in another reality, on another frequency, on another wavelength. So to my mind, that is more what people might term ascension.
Right. Would you say then that you have to go through different stages before you reach coherence?
Oh, of course you do, because you have to learn coherence in your everyday life. You have to learn to align your ego. You have to put your ego into service for the greater good, to align with God or whatever you think of as being God. And then you have to become more coherent with your thoughts, with your actions. And then you also at the same time have to start regular spiritual practices so that over time your thalamus becomes more sensitive. Then you can, yes, over time, you can definitely become enlightened, more coherent. But I'm really keen to say, Mark, and I dealt with this a lot in the book, I do not invite people to go to the jungles of South America and try ayahuasca, because as Professor Velodo said, who is a very experienced scientist and a shaman with 25 years training, he said he only knows about 4 right masters in Peru and in the Amazon who can apply ayahuasca safely. And he said a lot of people go on these spiritual holidays, try ayahuasca, think it's absolutely astonishing, but apparently it can make your energy field very, very unstable, and it can lead to a spiritual emergency later on. So and many, many young people who are trying crack, ecstasy, cocaine, they are damaging their brains beyond repair, and they are triggering spontaneous Kundalini awakenings. And of course, they're not prepared. They're having awakenings like I did in a body that's totally not prepared for it. They're not coherent in their diet. They have no coherence in their control of their emotions. Whereas masters of self have spent 20, 30, 40 years learning how to integrate all of the gifts that you have access to once you link to total coherence.
Right. It's quite a warning, really, for a lot of younger people who could get sucked in there, really, I suppose.
Oh, I mean, I cannot even begin to stress how dangerous it can be. And therefore, I think that the reason I had my particular experience, because spontaneous awakenings, I hadn't taken any drugs, but my nerves were shattered. I was exhausted at the time. And most psychiatrists now, people like Stan Groff, who term the phrase spiritual emergency, he's written some brilliant books like The Stormy Search for Self, which helped me a lot during my spiritual emergency. And he's found people that have spiritual emergencies when they're in a very a long-term stress situation. Sometimes it happened, as in his wife's case, when she was giving birth, but that's fairly rare. It can happen during tantric sex, which I definitely wasn't having at the time. So, there are many, many different factors at play here. So it's not a subject that you can deal with lightly in like 10 minutes. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I understand, yeah. obviously in the book there's lots of different interesting concepts that are discussed. Obviously we haven't got time to discuss them all, but one I was going to ask you is that of the orb phenomenon. I myself have taken many photos in the past few years where orbs have appeared in the shot,